Well, so we've been working with a number of state and federal government agencies and catchment management authorities and other NRM bodies on the intersection between climate resilience and environmental markets. And as part of that project, this was in the Climate Adaptation Mission, as part of that project, we realised we were making a big assumption about to what extent does land managers getting involved in environmental markets actually lead to climate resilience outcomes, because if you look at it in detail, it's not necessarily a sure thing, and there's risks and opportunities to manage. And so the core idea of this project with the Goulburn Broken Catchment Management Authority was to really interrogate under what conditions would we see positive or negative outcomes between more land managers being involved in environmental markets on the one hand, and climate resilience outcomes on the other. What most people would think when you say environmental markets is things like carbon and biodiversity offsets. However, what we've learnt through this project and related ones is that land managers look at it in a much more holistic way, and I think the best definition that covers what I think is the true situation is that an environmental market exists when someone can show they've improved the ecosystem services produced by the land that they manage, and someone else is willing to value that in some way that results in a value exchange between those two people. In concrete terms, this can certainly be things like carbon and biodiversity offsets. Sometimes banks and insurers are willing to give preferential rates to people who are demonstrating that they're reducing their footprint of their operations. And it can also be environmental certification. It can be demonstrating the environmental performance of your products and operations to consumers who may be willing to pay a premium, or in some cases with increasing attention in supply chains to carbon and biodiversity offsets amongst other ecosystem services. They want their suppliers to actually be carbon neutral or biodiversity positive before they can even sell to them. And in countries like the EU, there is increasing attention to what some people would call carbon borders. There's the likelihood of biodiversity being considered as well. And so long story short is that there's a lot of different ways that value exchange can take place, and a lot of them are coming from people in broader society, economy, legislation and frameworks wanting to see an improvement in land management practices that leads to ecosystem services being increased places. So environmental markets is that value exchange that recognises all these different ways it can happen. Some land governance bodies, whether it's local government, NRM bodies, state governments, also give rates relief or tax incentives for land managers who can show that they're improving their land management too. So it's really very diverse, and farmers are weighing up the costs and benefits and the risks and opportunities of all these different options when people are asking them to improve their land management practices. Well, climate resilience is a very multifaceted concept, but in essence, resilience on its own is the ability of a system, which can be people, ecosystem, a community, to bounce back from a shock. That's the core definition. But when we're talking about people in particular, we also have to talk about the social and economic dimensions of it. It's not simply returning to the state it was. It's also about dealing with people's desire for increasing well-being and prosperity and other things. And so I think the most widely used understanding of resilience, particularly in the context of climate these days, is to not just bounce back, but to also improve and grow so that what we value and is important to us continues to thrive. In the context of climate in particular, we know on the one hand that the assumptions of a safe and stable climate and cheap and abundant energy are no longer true. That's something we've built our whole civilization around, really. And so whether you're talking about major corporations, a hospital, local governments, or in this case land managers and farmers, they have to adjust to these changes, and that can be everything from slower changes in average temperatures and changes in rainfall. We're expecting increased frequency of extreme events, but less rain overall, for example, in Victoria. It can mean changes in the availability of inputs and the expectations of outputs of farms. So some of those supply chain pressures I mentioned around environmental markets is one example of that. And it can also mean things like changes in the accessibility and availability of labour or skilled trades and so on they need too. And so climate resilience is that ability to bounce back and thrive in the face of these challenges. And we can also usefully think of it as having 3 layers. One layer being the ability to definitely bounce back from the existence of a harm, like an extreme weather event. But we can also talk about it being about improving the performance of what we value within more incremental changes. And then where the ability to bounce back and or thrive requires really deep structural changes, we can also talk about transformative adaptation, which is where we're really shaking things up and changing the nature of underlying power relationships, economics, major infrastructure, and other substantial changes that really change the game for the people involved. So this was the core question of the research project with the Goulburn Broken, and to answer it, we did a mix of looking at global literature in a scoping review. We did interviews with local stakeholders, people working in natural resource management, adaptation planning, people consulting and advising for farmers. And we also held a participatory forum in the Goulburn Broken region where we explored the results of those exercises and tried to look at the questions of so what out of that. So basically, we found that there are scenarios where that overlap between environmental markets and climate resilience can be positive, and there are also those that can be negative. We found that, on the one hand, there is a big expectation from national and international governments and governance bodies, from corporates and environmental, social and governance, corporate social responsibility dimensions, that land managers should improve their land management practices and make those improvements available through things like offsetting to big corporations and big institutions to offset their own footprint. And unfortunately, this can work in negative ways against what we value in terms of land management in local areas. And so what farmers and their supporters were concerned about was the scale of land management changes, and would that lead to undesirable impacts in terms of local economies and communities. There are some scientific reasons to be cautious about some of these large-scale landscape changes, such as whether or not we're returning existing vegetation to where it was before major interruptions due to white land management practices in Australia over the last 200 years, or if we're actually fundamentally changing ecosystems in terms of planting forests where they weren't there before. So all these dimensions come into it, and the difference between that being a positive or negative thing seems to be whether or not there is a level of what I think of as right scaling of those dimensions, so that whatever investment and development happens is in a way that is harmonious and suitable for what's important in those local areas, what people value. The Goulburn Broken region is fortunate in that they have a regional catchment strategy which articulates quite clearly what those visions look like, and they've really looked across their region and broken it down into 6 areas where they have discrete visions of what the land management futures that they want to see look like in those areas. And so I think the conditions under which we would see environmental markets leading to climate resilience is ones where that alignment is sought between those localised visions and these global risks and opportunities that are coming down. And what came through very clearly in this project and in related projects is that local community-based natural resource management groups, the NRM region, which in this case is the Catchment Management Authority, local government, some of the community and NGO groups around the area, state government, they can all play a really important role in mediating between those top-down forces, if you like, and the bottom-up needs and interests of the farmers involved in those areas too. And it's really about finding that sort of right scaling fit between these different pressures. All right, so there's some of the specific risks and opportunities. So if you're considering getting involved in some effort to baseline and improve your land management, there's upfront costs to consider. There's your dependence on third parties' expertise and advice. There's a lot of distrust of for-profit orientated providers of these things out there that farmers are concerned about. At the community and regional scale, I mentioned that there's concerns about will it lead to positive or negative outcomes for the local community and local economy. And there's also concerns and interest in whether it's a net gain or not for the ecosystem. Will it actually sequester carbon? Will it improve biodiversity and things of that nature? On the positive side of it, farmers and their supporters are excited about the potential to diversify their sources of income on the farm, to deepen their relationships with supply chains and better adjust what they can produce to what's needed out there, and have that better valued by their people purchasing their products. They're optimistic, I guess, about the potential for trusted advisors to help them make good decisions in this space, but they're not seeing them there yet, and they want to see more of that support. And many of the land managers we've spoken to and their supporters also genuinely value the opportunity to leave the land in a better condition than they left it, but they just don't want to do that at the cost of a productive farm, and they're looking for that sort of stewardship win-win between production and environmental outcomes. So we had a number of really great recommendations coming out of the forum that address this, and I encourage people to read them closely. But in broad terms, there was a recognition that there is a need to increase the capability of land managers and their supporters in the region to understand and engage with these opportunities. There was a thought that there'd be opportunities for local TAFE and universities to get involved in that and work together, but also that there was a responsibility of people to self-educate and explore these things. The Catchment Management Authority is keen to facilitate this through things like establishing a community of practice. That was something that was established as an idea. And then, of course, they and some of these other actors can play a role in engaging with some of the state and federal policies and frameworks that support and enable environmental market transactions of different kinds. I think the issue of right scaling the type of engagement environmental markets in different regions is an important one. So they talk about the commuting hills, for example, in the southern parts of the catchment closer to Melbourne. And they have quite a different profile of land management, of occupants, of property sizes, of production than people in the agricultural floodplains out in the northwest, closer to the Murray-Darling. And there's variations across the 6 different regions. And so, again, finding the right way to engage with environmental markets for those different regions, reflecting those different needs and characteristics will be really important. So I think it will be a very local to global, or what some people call glocal, process to realise the opportunities and manage the risks.